her smile without trying too hard. "I must confess," David said, leaning forward slightly, "I was quite nervous about tonight. My daughter practically pushed me out the door." Margaret chuckled. "Emily did the same to me. I suppose our children think we're incapable of finding our own company. Or perhaps they see something we're too cautious to pursue ourselves." There was wisdom in his words, and Margaret appreciated it. They talked about their children, the strange blessing and burden of being widowed parents. David's daughter lived in Seattle now, working in technology. His son had given him 2 grandchildren who visited every summer. Sophie returned with their wine, placing the glasses down with practiced care. As she set Margaret's glass before her, something fell onto the white tablecloth. A small folded napkin. Margaret glanced down at it, then up at Sophie, who gave the slightest shake of her head before walking away. The gesture was so subtle that David, reaching for his wine, didn't notice. The napkin sat there like a tiny weight. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for it, unfolding it beneath the table. The handwriting was hurried but clear. "She's not who you think. Be careful." The words seemed to shimmer before her eyes. Margaret's heart began to pound. She looked up at David, who was smiling and saying something about his recent trip to visit his son. His face was open, honest, kind, but the note said otherwise. Margaret's mind raced. Should she excuse herself? Should she confront him? The rational part of her brain insisted there must be some mistake, some explanation. But years of life had taught her that women's intuition, especially when voiced by other women, should never be dismissed. "Margaret, are you all right?" David's voice pulled her back. She realized she had gone silent, her fingers gripping the napkin under the table. "Yes, I'm sorry. Just a bit warm," she managed. "Shall I ask them to adjust the temperature?" No, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. The note had poisoned the evening. Every smile from David now seemed potentially false. Every kind word felt like it might be manipulation. She excused herself to the restroom, taking her purse with the napkin tucked inside. In the quiet of the ladies' room, Margaret stared at her reflection. Her face was flushed, her eyes uncertain. What did Sophie know? How did she know it? And what exactly did "not who you think" mean? When she emerged, she caught Sophie's eye near the kitchen entrance. The younger woman glanced toward the back hallway, a clear invitation. Margaret followed, her heart hammering. They stood in the narrow corridor between the restrooms and the kitchen, away from the dining room's view. "I'm sorry," Sophie said immediately, her voice low and urgent. "I know that was terrifying, but I had to warn you." "Warn me about what? Who is he?" Sophie's face was pained. "That man you're with, David. He comes here often. Always with different women around your age. Always the same routine. Charming conversation, talk about his late wife, his garden, his grandchildren." Margaret felt cold despite the warmth of the restaurant. "That doesn't mean anything wrong." I know, Sophie said quickly. "And maybe it wouldn't. Except my mother was one of those women 6 months ago." The hallway seemed to tilt. "Your mother?" He was wonderful to her. Attentive, kind, everything she'd hoped for after Dad passed. They dated for 3 months. He borrowed money, always with good reasons. His daughter's medical bills, his grandson's school fees, a roof repair. My mom gave him nearly $20,000 before I finally convinced her to look into his story. Margaret's hands went to her face. Oh no, there was no sick daughter, no grandson in private school. Just a man who's very good at finding lonely widows and gaining their trust. Sophie's, eyes filled with tears. My mom was devastated. Not even about the money, though, that hurt. It was the betrayal. She thought she'd found someone who truly cared. "Did you report him?" Mom wouldn't. She was too embarrassed. "But I've been watching for him since. When I saw you come in tonight looking so hopeful, I couldn't just let it happen again. Margaret leaned against the wall, her mind spinning. How do I know you're telling the truth? Maybe you're mistaken. I wish I was, Sophie said sadly. She pulled out her phone and showed Margaret several photos of David with different women, all taken discreetly in the restaurant. I'm not proud of this, but after what happened to Mom, I started documenting. Look at the dates. The photos spanned months. Different women, different seasons, but always the same man with the same warm smile. Margaret felt something crumble inside her chest. Not heartbreak for David, whom she'd known only an hour, but grief for the possibility he'd represented. The chance at companionship, the hope that loneliness might end. What should I do? She whispered. Sophie squeezed her arm gently. That's up to you. But whatever you decide, don't go home with him. Don't give him your address, and definitely don't loan him money, no matter how convincing his story is. Margaret nodded slowly, straightening her shoulders. At 62, she'd survived her husband's death, raised 2 children, built a career as a teacher, and navigated countless disappointments. She could handle this. She returned to the table with steady steps. David looked up with concern. Is everything all right? You were gone a while. I'm fine, Margaret said, sitting down. Actually, David, I need to be honest with you. His expression shifted just slightly, a wariness entering his eyes. Of course. The waitress just told me something interesting. About your late wife. Oh? Yes. About how you've mentioned her to several women who've sat in this very restaurant. Different women. Many different women. The warmth drained from David's face. For a moment, he looked as if he might deny it, spin another story. But then something changed. His shoulders sagged. The mask slipped. I see, he said quietly. Is there anything you'd like to say? David was silent for a long moment, staring at his wine glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of its earlier warmth. My wife did die. That part's true. And the rest? I lost everything in bad investments after she passed. The house, the savings, everything. I was drowning and I didn't know how else to survive. He looked up at her, and for the first time that evening, she saw something real in his eyes. Shame. I'm not proud of it. That doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. He reached for his wallet. I'll pay for the wine and leave. I'm sorry, Margaret, truly. Margaret watched him stand. This man who had seemed so promising an hour ago. She felt Sophie's eyes on her from across the restaurant. She thought of Sophie's mother, of all the other women who'd sat where she was sitting, full of hope. David, she said, stopping him. You need help, real help. Not money, but counseling. There are resources for people struggling financially. The community center has programs. I should know, I volunteer there on Tuesdays. He looked at her with surprise. After what I tried to do, you're offering help? I'm offering information. What you do with it is your choice. But this path you're on, it's not just hurting others. It's destroying you. For a moment, she saw tears in his eyes. He nodded once, then walked out into the rain without another word. Margaret sat alone at the table, feeling the weight of the evening settle over her. Sophie approached cautiously. Are you okay? Margaret looked up at this young woman, who had risked awkwardness and confrontation to protect a stranger. Thanks to you, yes. You were very brave. I just couldn't watch it happen again. Sophie hesitated. Can I get you anything? Dinner on the house? Margaret smiled, feeling tired but also strangely peaceful. Just the check for the wine, dear. And maybe your mother's phone number, if she'd be willing. I think we might have quite a bit to talk about. Sophie's face brightened. She'd like that. She's been lonely since the whole thing happened. As Margaret waited for the check, she thought about the evening's strange turns. She'd come hoping for romance and found deception. But she'd also found something perhaps more valuable. A reminder that kindness still existed, that women still looked out for each other, that disappointment didn't have to mean defeat. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "How's it going, Mom?" Margaret smiled and typed back, "Long story. I'll tell you tomorrow. But I think I just made a new friend." She left a generous tip for Sophie, including a note with her own phone number. As she stepped back out into the rain, Margaret felt the cool drops on her face and found herself smiling. Yes, the date had been a disaster. Yes, her hope for romance had been crushed before it could even begin. But she'd been reminded that she was strong, that she had good instincts, and that there were still good people in the world looking out for each other. At 62, those lessons felt more valuable than any dinner date could have been. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle as she walked to her car. Somewhere in the city, David was hopefully rethinking his choices. Sophie was finishing her shift, knowing she'd done the right thing. And Margaret was heading home to call her daughter and then, perhaps, reach out to Sophie's mother about coffee. Life hadn't given her the evening she expected, but it had given her something real, something true. And at this stage of life, Margaret knew that truth and kindness were worth far more than pretty lies and false promises. As she drove home through the quiet streets, she thought about what she'd tell Emily. Not a story of disaster, really, but of unexpected grace. Of how a waitress's courage had protected her. Of how even disappointment could lead to connection. Of how life, even in your 60s, still had the power to surprise you with its strange and beautiful turns. And when she finally pulled into her driveway, Margaret realized she wasn't sad at all. She was grateful. Grateful for Sophie's bravery, for her own wisdom in listening, for the reminder that she was never truly alone in this world. Tomorrow she'd call Sophie's mother. Next week she'd return to her volunteer work at the community center. And someday perhaps she'd try again at finding companionship. But this time with her eyes wide open and her instincts fully trusted. The note had said, "She's not who you think." But in the end, it was David who wasn't what he seemed. And Margaret, looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror, realized she was exactly who she'd always been. Strong, wise, and still beautifully capable of choosing kindness over bitterness. That was enough for tonight. That was more than enough. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share it with others who might need this reminder about kindness and wisdom. Subscribe to hear more stories about real life, real people, and the unexpected grace we find in difficult moments. And please leave a comment below about a time when a stranger's kindness made a difference in your life. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.